Welcome everybody, and wherever you are, I hope you are safe from the COVID pandemic that's ravaging all countries, and especially if you're in India. I hope whichever God you pray to is helping you out because the government isn't. Welcome to this series of the Smart Entrepreneur Decoded. What are we trying to do here? When young people think of entrepreneurship, a couple of myths and preconceived notions cross their mind. One, most of them think it's a young man's game. Most of them get carried away by the media report of the wild successes or the spectacular failures, which is really a minuscule 0.001% of the world of entrepreneurship. But it's the media's job to glorify success and failure, and everything else between. The 99.99% of people like us in between are left to wonder how to get there. The interviews with these spectacular successes and failures are full of hyperbole, full of fluff, full of sugar-coated stuff, romanticized, almost like a movie script. You can never get any real insight into it. You can never scratch the surface and know the person. So I thought, let's put together a series where we can speak to people and understand their stories, understand what drives them, and see if we can learn something from them. Nobody can teach you anything. Nobody can do things for you. Only you can help yourself. But if you get a few inputs with your natural intelligence, you should be able to choose and try paths and see what works for you and what doesn't. This will not be a series where you will get motivational talks. This will not be a series where we will give you solace. This is a series where we give you solutions. This is a series where we tell you how to fill the gap between probability and possibility. With that, I would like to introduce to you our first guest, Mr. Leo Fernandes. He's a CEO of Talentees, but I have known him from a time well before he set up Talentees. We were colleagues 20 years ago. Highly qualified, has worked for top companies like the Tatas, Accenture, Hewitt for long periods of time globally in Singapore, India, led organizations in the BPO space, led transformation initiatives. And when you hear him, you will understand why I admire him so much. Very often when you hear the so-called successful people, you wonder behind the fluff and the flakiness. You wonder, do they become successful and then talk like this? Or they always spoke like this and hence became successful? In Leo's case, it's the latter. When I see him today, and I think back 20 years ago, he was always like this. Strong set of values, very strong moral guiding force, and full of energy, positivity, and tremendous knowledge. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Leo Fernandes as our guest for tonight to discuss what his entrepreneurship journey has been like.
Thank you so much, Nalin. Thank you very much for that very, very gracious introduction. My absolute pleasure to be here with you.
I gave that introduction in the hope that your wife and family is listening. It's amazing. It's amazing when people introduce you. Sometimes the most surprised person is your wife. Is this the same guy? So Leo, welcome. Very, very warm welcome. Do you think entrepreneurship is a young man's game?
I think it's a young man at heart game. I don't think it matters what your calendar age is, but I do think you need to approach it with a young at heart spirit. And I think the rest doesn't matter. I've seen very, very successful entrepreneurs who are, starting off in their 60s and 70s, and you're just absolutely inspired by them. And you've also seen kids who kind of are almost bearing the weight of the world before they are 22 and have already turned negative. And so I think it's not so much calendar age, but I certainly think you need to be young at heart.
Young at heart. Okay. So you were working for all these wonderful companies and probably had a very steady career. And I know you were right at the top. And you started Talentees, what, 10 years ago, 11 years ago?
Yes, 2000, yes, 2011, 10 years ago.
Yeah. So you're probably in your 40s when you started this. What made you do it? I mean, something switched, didn't get a job, and what happened?
Yeah, no, I think that's a question that is worth always reflecting on, even through the journey. For me personally, I'd always wanted to do something with children and young adults, but it was something that I said I would do in my retirement. So I felt that I would do that later. So I think one is that I think during the time I had started to question whether I genuinely believed in this. If I had a genuine conviction for making a difference by working with children and young adults, then I needed to give some active years of my life. So I think one was that kind of looking yourself in the mirror and asking yourself whether this is genuine conviction or is it just going to be convenience that you will take on at the end of your career. Second, I think, was also in some ways a search for meaning. I think in many ways, my entrepreneurial journey is kind of tied in with my own spiritual journey, your own search for yourself. So I do think that in the corporate world, and in no way do I think that it is, worse than an entrepreneurial journey. I think you can be happy and successful and find meaning in a corporate journey as well. But for me personally, I felt that I wanted, to spend my life doing something a little more meaningful, so that at the end of the day, I would feel that I had made a difference. Which, as I said, you still do that in the corporate world, but I felt I would get a lot more meaning in this path. And I think it was a little bit of a terrifying choice because I don't come from a business family. I think when I told my family for the first time, it was, shall I say, undiluted horror on their faces. But I think, ultimately, they were the ones who supported and made the decision possible. So I look back on it as a decision that led me to a path of meaning, which I was fortunate to be able to walk these past few years.
Actually, I was coming to that point about family because when I broke the news to my family about doing entrepreneurship, it was more about telling them rather than asking them. And I made them live in horror. So I know the reaction, but what was it? Was it a choice you gave them, or you just said you're going to do this and...
I think immediately the first choice I made was that I would not do it without the support of the family. I think when I told them that I was thinking about it and they were initially hesitant, I made a very clear choice that if my family didn't back it, then I would not make the choice, because I think it's critical for your family to be behind you. And I think I was very fortunate that over time they saw the sense in it and even made it possible. In many ways, I think without the sacrifices they made, it wouldn't even have been possible.
Yeah, that's an interesting difference between starting entrepreneurship when you're young versus later in life, because you have mortgages to pay, you have children's universities fee payments, and a whole set of responsibilities you just can't run away from. And you need to plan a lot more and take the family along. Whereas if you're on your father's payroll as a young man, you can pretty much try stuff. I mean, I'm not belittling either, but there is a little bit more room to experiment and fail. But when in midlife, when you get into entrepreneurship, the room and margin for failure is not an option, is it?
No, that's very, very true. I think when you make that decision much later in life, it has to be a much more thought through decision. Whereas, as you say, when you're in your early 20s, you can very whimsically decide to quit a job and go and set up a business, and you won't pay too much of a price if it went wrong. But I think when later on in life, there's a lot more, shall I say, skin in the game. So you have to make it in a more deliberate way, because it's not just you who are going to pay the consequences. It's your family, any people that you hire. I think it's an enormous responsibility. So I think it's a decision that should never be made lightly. And I look back on several colleagues whom I advised against making the decision, right? So, and I think in that also has merit, because I think you should sometimes decide not to go down the entrepreneurial path, and that's a good enough decision as well.
I wish I had spoken to you in 2007.
You were always born to be an entrepreneur, Nalin.
Talk to me about the early days. It's okay to have a passion and vision about yourself that I want to do something with children. Even I wanted to do something with the film industry and made a hash of it. So you wanted to do something with children. How did you identify the problem you were going to solve?
So I think there were two inspirations, shall I say, for what Talentees eventually did, right? One was my own experience with the employees. I mean, right from the time that, we have worked together, I would constantly see how we would do learning and development, training programs, get excellent feedback, right? Everyone would give excellent feedback, but Monday morning, everyone's back to biting each other's head off, right? So I remember my L&D head would always come with an increased budget for the next year. And I was always happy to sanction that, saying that, but I treat it as an investment. There must be ROI, right? So where's the ROI? Where's the return on this? So I think at some stage, I realized that a lot of what we were trying to do to 25-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds was just too late. It was too hardwired over decades. So I would say that is the first inspiration, that a lot of these skills that we were teaching in the workplace, I felt should have been taught at school, at college, so that, it was not something, as Manish used to say, a repair job that you do later on. The second kind of trigger was the Nirbhaya incident. I think when the Nirbhaya incident happened, that was also for me personally a very kind of look in the mirror moment, because we were complaining about it, we were angry about it. But I think the question was, what are you personally doing about it? So there also I felt that Nirbhaya was not so much a failure of the government, of legislation. It was a failure of a home and a classroom, right? Some home failed, some classroom failed. And that's why you have Nirbhayas and disrespect for women. So in fact, Talent is one of the values out of the values that we teach children and young adults. One of the first values we decided on was respect for women. And that was something very, very meaningful for me to do. So I really think this was the trigger to decide. I was clear I didn't want to do academics because there were enough number of people doing maths, physics, chemistry. But I personally felt called to this.
That I can understand that. But one fine day sitting in Hyderabad, did you just start going to schools and saying, I'm going to teach your children some values? What were the early days like?
I think the early days were extremely difficult. Because I think while schools violently agree with what you're saying, that, it's very, very important and it's very, very critical, but their heart, their mind, their soul is in maths, physics, chemistry, and marks. So I think the early days, it was very difficult to even find someone who would believe in it strongly enough to treat it as a business. We were clear that we were not an NGO. We wanted to, to run this as a business. So the early days were a lot of, knocking on doors and getting them slammed in your face, or waiting in principals' offices for hours. And that also is, to those thinking about shifting from a, corporate job, I think that can come as a little bit of a shock for some of us who are used to the corporate trappings. You must be prepared to go out there without the air cover of the brand that you're used to, the air cover of the, the large support teams that you had, and really get into the trenches. So it was my co-founder and I on the road, going school after school, meeting people. We were fortunate to get one break where a school leader believed in us and started us off with one assignment. And in that small school in Chennai, we began. And I say this because we knew it, right? We knew we were getting into this. We knew that everyone wanted academics. I remember the first program that we had, when there were just some children walking in for registration. I literally was telling parents, I hope you know that this has nothing to do with academics. I was literally wondering whether they were sending the children thinking it was an academic improvement program. So I think, those early days were hard. And even now, it's a difficult conversation to get people to believe that this is critical to do early.
Were there points where you thought, let's go back, this is too tough?
I think not. I think I deeply believed in this. So when I bought my ticket, it was a one-way ticket. I really, was convinced that this is something that needs to be done. I know that the market may take more time to develop. It may take more time for people to understand its importance. But I was deeply convinced. And I think a lot of that conviction came from seeing the impact on children. Because when we worked with children, they were the most amazing ambassadors for what we were doing. So while you could say that it is difficult to convince school and college leadership, the work we did with children kind of validated, what we were doing. Every experience where a child told us that, I have changed, I'm doing something differently because of a Talent East program, I think that was a huge conviction and validation for us.
So, having spoken to you over the years as you set this up and watched the delivery model, most of it was an in-person delivery model, and you touched hundreds of thousands of children's lives. When the pandemic hit, what happened?
What happened is we fell off the cliff because 100% of our business was an in-classroom model. Because we believed that was the best way. And even though earlier on we had kind of dabbled with going online, we were never sure that that was the right format to use to deliver the skills and value. So ours was an entirely classroom. So we kind of fell off the cliff overnight. And I think in some ways that prompted us to go online, helped us adapt to go online. And I'm very proud of the team, the way that they rallied around and said, whatever it takes. I had calls from friends from different parts of the world saying, what Talent East is doing is too important to fail. So, even if you need help with your salary checks, we're going to send something for you, but, keep at it. So that was a huge, inspiration to see the faith that people had in what we were doing.
So, the edutech sector has got so big. We may argue in the wrong way, in the wrong direction, but it has got so big. And everybody has digitized post-pandemic. Is it just taking the same class teacher and shooting a video? Or do you have to think of the complete instructional design all over again because the medium is different?
I think you must do it completely differently. As we were discussing the other day as well, I think you cannot afford to do a Control-C, Control-V. I think a mistake would be to treat, because I think that's what most schools have done. If you look at the academic side of it, what schools have done is just converted what used to be an in-classroom lecture. Whereas I think the digital format is a completely blank piece of paper with a whole new set of opportunities and an opportunity to put the child back in the center, to give the child the power to self-learn. So I think you really need to relook at the format. And honestly, we ourselves are learning. So we are very much in the early stages. We are trying to see how to make it more interactive, how to put the student and the child at the center of the session. So our temptation is still to do it the traditional way, to just, as you said, just digitize what you were doing in the offline. But I think the digital medium, that would be underutilizing it if you just did that.
Couple of more questions on the business, then we'll shift to some other topic.
Sure.
Have you raised money in the business? In the traditional, conventional sense from VCs and all that?
Not really, and that was also one of the difficult decisions to make, because in some sense we felt that taking VC money would close certain choices that we wanted to have to ourselves, right? So we routinely make non-commercial decisions, right? So sometimes we meet a rural school, they can't afford to pay the commercial rate, but we know that the principal is backing it, the students want to do it, and we just go ahead and say yes. And I doubt any VC would allow us to take business where you're losing money. And honestly, we do that because somehow we find that it pays for itself in some way. I really can't even explain it. But every time we have done that, in some way we find the money that comes in from some other source to ensure that. But I think that was one reason that we were keen not to go unless we found someone who was so completely aligned with that same mission. Yeah. So we did pay a price by saying no to that. So bootstrapping was a lot harder, a lot more difficult journey. But I think also it gave us the flexibility to run the business exactly the way that we wanted to do, and to make a choice on the spot without the fear of what the VC's expectations are going to be.
Interestingly, you say that we find so many young people, because I work in that space of raising money, young people chasing valuation instead of creating value. So for all of you watching this, here's a lesson on creating value first and thinking about the valuation later. So many people, so many businesses come to investors and actually they don't need money. They need advice. But they are just caught up in this whole valuation game and they just want to raise money for the sake of it. It's almost like a social status now.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting point to make and very important one as well. Could you help our viewers with, say, 3 things, 3 traits, or 3 skills, whatever you call it, that you need to go through the journey of entrepreneurship? I'm not talking about success. I'm not talking about wildly being successful. Just 3 skills. What is it that they need?
So the first is, I would say, marry right. Because one of the biggest blessings for me has been my wife, Teresa, right? So she not only made the journey possible, but just having her support has made all the difference to me. So I would say, we spoke about this right up front, that your entrepreneurial journey, if your family is not, fully behind it, your wife is not fully behind it, I think you're going to find that take a toll at some stage. The other advice I would always say is to, keep it simple. I think very often, particularly when I meet with young people thinking about entrepreneurship, there is a tendency, I mean, you and I know, right? When we used to see slides, people used to look at putting, the more complicated you make the slide, they think it looks more impressive. But I think it takes a lot of skill to keep something simple. I'm always reminded of Johan Cruyff, one of my favorite footballers. He used to say that it is a very simple thing to play football, but it is very difficult to play simple football. One of the hardest things in life is to play simple football. So I always admired that what he used to say. And I think the same thing is true of entrepreneurship, that you must try to keep things simple. Don't overcomplicate the product. Don't overcomplicate these things. At its core, you're looking at serving human beings with the needs. So I think that's important to keep things simple. And the third, I would say, is just grit. You must have the grit that comes from a conviction to survive the good days, the bad days, and stay true to what you believe in. I remember one school that we met with. It took me, I think, 29 meetings, to get the contract signed. And many times on those long drives to the school, I was questioning whether I had crossed the line from perseverance to insanity. Because you're really questioning, should I be doing this? But somehow I think all the times that we just stuck it out, we finally saw some, meaning at the end of that tunnel. So I would say, those 3 things, have the right people. I'm saying not just my wife, but having the right people. That's been another huge blessing for me, right? From my co-founder, Pradeep, to all the people that I was sent through my journey. I think that's been a huge blessing. Then the keeping it simple, and I would say grit.
Yeah. So one, have a support group. And if you have a family and you're married, right, you're lucky. The next one is obviously to keep it simple. Most things in life are very simple. Want to lose weight, exercise more, eat less. But it's not easy. And thirdly, grit, a very underappreciated skill. Or, the tenacity, grit, perseverance. But there does come a point, where, especially for young people, do you think it's okay to say, enough, I want to do something else, or I'll try something else? Because the corporate jargon or the slogans or the taglines they are growing up with are quite dangerous. These are just beautiful rhyming words strung together, right? Better to try and fail than not try at all. The entrepreneurship is like jumping off a cliff without a parachute and something will open within. I jump off a table, I break a leg. They are being fed all this. Is it okay to back off and say, I'll try something else? This is not working out.
I think it's critical that you keep that option always on the table. So I'm so glad that, we did the series I read in one of your messages, right? It's entrepreneurial excellence, not entrepreneurial perfection. Because there's a big difference between those two. And I think young people should realize that saying no to an idea, saying no to the entrepreneurial journey is as much, a badge of honor choice. I remember doing a session on entrepreneurship for school students. And I asked them at the beginning of the session, to raise hands, how many would become entrepreneurs? And at the end of the session, and it was less than half the hands at the end of the session. And told myself I had done my job, because that's exactly what you want to convey, that it's not going to be an easy journey. In fact, I most often tell people, if you're going into entrepreneurship just to make money, just stay in the stock market or invest in a mutual fund, right? It's a very painful, difficult journey. So I would say, if you're not cut out for it, or don't have a deep passion for it, it's completely all right to say no to that path and embrace something else. All that matters is that you be the best you can be in it, and that journey could be very well as an employee in a company and doing very well there.
Yeah, some of the greatest CEOs, they're entrepreneurs in their own right.
Absolutely.
10x from where they took it.
Absolutely.
And you make an important point. For the same reason, many of my colleagues in my company don't put me in front of potential clients who are entrepreneurs, right? They need to raise funds. They come to our company, and I tell them why they should not do it, and we lose all potential clients. But it's so important. It's so important for people to stop giving motivational speeches to these people and tell them the facts of life. It is tough. You have chosen a tough path. It will be uphill, but it will also be very rewarding. It's just a trade-off. Choices you make every day.
Yeah.
Let's move to a slightly different topic. I have known you for close to 20 years, although it seems much less than that. And I've always seen this streak of great inner strength from a moral, ethical, spiritual point of view. How do you build this? How do you develop this? Did it come through family, education, your own learning, or you were just born with it? What is it?
So one is, I would credit my parents for cultivating in me and my brothers a deep faith in God. So I would say that is very, very central to my life, that my faith in God, and that I am loved by God, and that I must every day try in some way to fulfill His purpose for me in life. So I think having that inner, as you put it, compass has been a great sense of strength, a great sense of grace for me, right through my life. I also find that a daily habit of prayer, where I'm able to spend that half an hour in meditation time with God in the morning and in the evening. So one of the single most important habits that we teach even the children in Talentee's sessions is what we call triple S, or silence, stillness, and solitude. So every Talentee session begins with 2 minutes of triple S and ends with 2 minutes of triple S. And for me, that has been, something, that moment when I'm sitting down in the presence of God, to tap into and that wisdom, that grace, that strength, which is much, much bigger than anything that we could humanly bring. So I would say that has been the biggest factor in my life, that gives me the strength to carry on.
And in today's, noisy world of so many mentors, guides, bloggers, sometimes I feel there are more bloggers than there are readers, more podcasters than there are listeners, more authors than there are readers now. It's so difficult. You're speaking of something so essential, the 3 S's, and they are busy with fit, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. They are completely defined by that. I don't blame them, I mean, that is the way their generation is. But these values of just sitting with yourself, treating prayer as not necessarily a religious activity, because young people think differently, but as an activity of discovering yourself, and spending time in meditating, or just calming down, or just slowing things down in your mind. So essential to have that as a habit. Talk to me about your role models. Any 1 or 2 people who influenced you, and why?
Well, in many ways, I would say my parents are my first role models. One, again, I would go back to Dad's courage of conviction. 4 of us boys saw times when he paid a price professionally because he stood by his convictions. And I think that was an important lesson, that a conviction is only a conviction if you're willing to pay the price for it. Otherwise, it's just a soundbite, right? So I think that was something that courage of conviction is what I learned from my father. And I think from my mother, the 2 things that I treasure are her absolute cheerfulness. There was nothing that would ever keep her down, right? She was so cheerful and positive. I think always to be able to look at life and say, let's count our blessings instead of complaining about what went wrong. And the other thing I've learned from my mom is learnability. She is, one of the people who she's now, going to turn 80 next year. But she'll read The Economist, she'll read the Harvard Business Review, she'll read the Economic Times, she'll read anything possible, and she will have a conversation. And I think that has been a tremendous role model for me. These two people who my brothers and I owe so much to in our lives.
So, knowing a little bit about your family, there are many authors in your family. Your father has written more than a dozen books, if I'm not mistaken. Your brother also. When do we see your book? I have been after you for years on that.
Yes, and Nalin, I must thank you, because you've been one of those, deep believers that I do have a book in me. So I do hope that this year we will have one out. I've begun work on it with a close friend of mine on the topic which is we are passionate about, which is what do we give young people at a young age in terms of skills and values. So we've just begun work on that. So looks like 2021 will be the year. So I've committed and promised myself that I'll reach you the draft during the course of this calendar year.
I'm really looking forward to that, because I read your posts on LinkedIn, which are not frequent enough. You write probably once in 3 months or something, but they're very insightful and make people reflect and think. Unfortunately, reading as a habit is dying, and I cannot emphasize enough to entrepreneurs, that they must read the right stuff.
Yeah.
Not the fit kind of stuff, right? Read the right stuff. So before we end, can you share with us one story in your entrepreneurship journey, either with a client, happy, sad, employee, whatever, which you think defined the company or made it what it is today? One incident, one story.
Actually, there are many stories that I think have given me that great joy and meaning. But one that I could share with you is when one of our facilitators, right? So we hire facilitators who are at all these different schools across, towns and cities. And one of our facilitators was sharing with us that she said, my parents don't recognize me after I've joined Talentees. They're asking, what's happened to you? You used to be this kind of a person, now you've become so patient. You used to be this kind of a person, now you... And I think that was a deeply insightful and meaningful moment for me, because here was a colleague sharing that they have personally changed. And they said, when we teach Talentees' inputs in the classroom, we are forced to change ourselves. We are forced to rethink some of our own beliefs, some of our own habits, some of our own behavior. And she said, Talentees has just helped me become a better person. And for me, no funding, no P&L, no balance sheet, success can replace the gold in that.
Yeah, that must have been really gratifying. Okay, so we are at the end of this session. I cannot thank you enough, Leo, for all our viewers. These are the kind of success stories which you will never come to know or never get to interact with the person, never get to hear them speak about those simple steps that made them what they are. People who pivoted their careers from a pure successful, highly successful corporate career to a completely different area because they had a strong sense of belief that they wanted to make a difference. People who did not go the conventional path of asking other people to fund their dreams. They bootstrapped. They went through the hard way. They did not just jump onto the technology bandwagon for the sake of technology. But when the time came, they have pivoted and delivered the same excellent services with the use of technology. In fact, we are partnering with them for Indonesia and hope to bring those great products to this country as well. Thank you very much, Leo, for your time and sharing your thoughts on your story. Thank you.
My absolute pleasure, Nalin. Thank you so much for having me on the show and for your friendship.
Thank you.
God bless.